Hey guys, Mike with All Dogs here. Today we're going to be installing a Titan swap on my 3rd gen Frontier. Don't have a ton of experience installing such a kit on a truck yet, so joining me today is going to be Kyle. I'm going to go over quickly what the base Titan swap kit consists of, and then we'll go from there.
I'm basically going to go over what our kits consist of. I'll briefly touch on different aspects of the kit when you see it on our website, and then kind of go over brands. Mike here is lucky enough that he is actually going to be throwing on our prototype icon kit that we have. But yeah, so I'm going to start at the front and then I'll go to the back. Also, while we are working on the 3rd gen, I am going to cover one piece that is specific to this if you do not order an OE component kit. The base kit is going to come with cam bolts and then our All Dogs Off-Road high clearance Titan upper control arms. You can option up to SPCs if you're interested in that. That way you have your full adjustability at the ball joint. The 3rd gen specifically, since we are working on this kit, is going to come with our ADO tie rod extensions. You can, in the OEM component upgrade, option for inner and outer tie rods, but these will come with your base kit. Next for the front will be our brake lines. You need extended brake lines for the added wheel travel that's going to be involved with the Titan swap. And then your choice of shock. We sell it in Radflow, Fox, and then Icon will be coming soon. Your Radflow kits are going to be your most optionable, to where you can go 2.0, 2.5, add remote reservoirs, add adjusters if you want. Fox kit will be 2.0s for now. We do have the option for 2.5s and 2.5s with adjusters if you're interested, but we don't sell them in a complete kit. And then, like I said, these Icons will be coming soon. Rear base kit will come with Adelifes. I have an Xterra Adeleaf here, but we have Xterra or Frontier. U-bolts, you can option for flip kit if you want. We're not going to be doing that on this. And then your bushings for your leaf pack option. Also, our Titan swap kits come with Daystar 1.5" shackles. Mike here is going to go with a CJD adjustable shackle, so you can do that if you want. Now I'm going to show you our OEM component kit and what it comes with if you option for that. As you go through our base kit on our website, there is an option for OE components and a drop down. We do get asked a lot on what the OE component option is, so I'm going to go over with you. OE component option is for you if you do not want to take the time to find all the extra parts, if you want to upgrade them or if you want to order them yourself, and we can do it for you. Basically, what our OEM component kit is going to have is Moog Titan lower control arms. It's going to come with Moog inner and outer Titan tie rods for 2nd gen, or an Xterra if you go that route, or Pathfinder. And then the last piece will be CV axles. This one's obviously dirty. We don't have any new ones around the shop, but when you order these, 99% of people are probably going to have an R180 front end, but if you do have an M205 and you have upgraded, when you order it, please email us and tell us you have an M205. That way we can get you the correct axles sent to you. One other piece, even though it's not in the OEM component, that's a popular option, is going to be wheel spacers for the rear. These are not a necessary component, but people buy these to try to match the extra track width at the front. These are 1.25 inch. These are the only ones we sell. They're made by Spider Tracks. They don't perfectly match, but they get close enough to where if you are worried about that extra added track width in the front and you want it to match, these will get you close. And these are pretty high quality. These are probably going to be one of the more high quality wheel spacers you can buy on the market. So now that that's covered, we're going to start at the rear. Mike is already extended traveled in the rear. If you are stock, you can start front or rear, but the rear will be easiest for us. So we will move on to that.
First things first, pull in your truck into a bay if you have the access to one. If not, you can also just lift your truck with a jack. Be sure to use the proper safety equipment, jack stands, anything to keep it from falling on you, basically. So yeah, we'll start with taking off the wheel itself and go from there. And off she goes.
So when you get under here in the rear, very first step you're going to want to do before you get anywhere is your ABS lines and your brake lines are going to be clipped into your axle. What we do here is we just take them out of their brackets and leave them hanging. None of us have ever had issues with it, so that's how we roll with it. This is only if you have a Pro-4x, but if you have a Pro-4x, you have to watch the tension on your wire here. If you stretch it, you may lose your locker function. So there's a couple places to disconnect it. I would say disconnect it while you're doing this, and then when you're done, check it and see if there's enough tension, if you have enough slack. But there's a small 8mm bolt on top here, or new to the 3rd gens, which we just found, is there's a 10mm bolt up here with a really odd clip that holds the wire here. So you can take it off in either spot, and then, like I said, when you're done, check the slack of it before you install it. But once those 3 are done and disconnected, next is going to be your sway bar brackets. These are going to be 14mm bolts. There's 2 on each side, or the top bolt where the bracket is slotted. So technically all you have to do is disconnect the bottom bolts, and then when that's done, you can just simply slide the brackets out and just leave your sway bar hanging. And this also is only applicable to 2020 and up 2nd gens and 3rd gens, and also Xterras, I guess, if you have an Xterra. But right now we're working on a Frontier. So there's that. Your factory shock bolts are going to be 19mm on both the nut and the bolt side. Your top shock nut is a 17mm, and it's really fine thread, so it will take a little bit to get off. For your factory shackles, they're going to be a 17mm nut, and I would say most people that are Titan swapping have already been lifted, so you either have an add-a-leaf in, or, as Mike has parabolics. If you're going from base truck to Titan swap, or with any lift in general, you'll be removing your U-bolts to either throw in your add-a-leaf or to replace your pack. The factory nut on the U-bolt is either 19 or 21. I don't have one handy, so I'm not positive on the size, but I'm pretty sure it's one of those 2. If you do order a kit from us, your U-bolts are going to be 22mm, the nuts for them. And then the only other nut and bolt on the rear that you would have to worry about is going to be your front bolt and the nut. Even if you have a lift in, it's still smart to loosen them. That way, when you pull down to throw your shackle in, there's not tension on the bushing. And if there's tension on a bushing, over time it will ruin it. So even though you're not taking it off, if you have this, and once again, this is only if you have a leaf pack installed or an add-a-leaf already installed, loosen it. That way the bushing is free. And then once you get everything installed and back on the ground on vehicle weight is when you would retorque that. From here, we are going to let Mike get to it, and I will jump in when he needs.
So after removing the wheels, we're going to relieve the stress off of both the brake line and the ABS line. The brake line should have one of these clips holding that in there. All you have to do is push it out with a flathead, and it should pop right out. And then once that's off, you can just relieve the pressure or tension off of those, and then we will move on to removing the sway bar. These will be 14s. For the sake of the video, we're going to be using an impact to get these off, and go from there. Okay, once you have the top bolts loosened and the bottoms removed, a few hits and it should pop right out. For the sake of not losing bolts, you can just leave these ones back in there or put them back in there. If you have a Pro-4x, you will need to remove the 2 8mm bolts from down here to relieve the stress off the locker cable. Or you can do, as Kyle mentioned before, there is a 10mm bolt up here as well. But I think for this one, we're just going to remove the 2 8mm bolts at the bottom. Cool. Plenty of slack. We're going to move to the lower shock bolt, and we're going to use 19 wrench and socket to get that out. And we're going to do that to both sides.
So since we're located in Nebraska, we have to fight corrosion on some of this stuff. And even with a truck as new as Mike's, with as new of a kit as it's on it, we still run into corrosion occasionally or stuff that fights us, as in the case with this Fox shock. The lower eyelet bolt on the rear shocks may get stuck if you live in a state where there's salt or corrosion in the winter. So just know that taking the lower bolt out might be a little bit of a fight. As we did here, we had to give it a little persuasion to get it out. But if you're lucky enough to live in a state where there's no salt or corrosion, good on you. If not, just know that this may be an issue. All right, so how we get these out, if you don't have an impact, what I would use is a ratchet. Put a ratchet on the bolt head and then use some kind of soft mallet, or put the nut back on the end of the bolt and tap on it or hit it. If you have a soft mallet, it's the best way to do it. But as you're spinning the bolt, tap it with the mallet and the bolt should slowly back out. And then at that point you can use whatever you need to get the bolt out, but just make sure you break it loose first.
Once you got the lower eyelet bolts out, it's time to move up to the top bolts for the shock, and that will be a 17 millimeter. Once you got the nut removed, it's going to take a little bit of persuasion to get off, but all you have to do is wiggle it back and forth, and it should slide right out. Oh, there we go.
So now the shocks are out of the truck. Basically what we're going to be doing now is relieving the tension on the shackles. Basically, easiest way to do it, truck's going to probably be on jack stands, or if you have a lift, either way, use a jack and simply jack up on the rear diff just a hair, and that it doesn't need to be much, it just needs to be enough to release the tension on the shackles. Once you take the nuts off the shackle, you can play with it, whether you got to lower it or raise it, however you do it. Just know that you need a jack to just release it enough to where you can pop the rear shackles out. Also, once the shackles are out, there will also be nothing holding the rear diff up at that point. So at the same time, you'll need it under there to keep the diff obviously off the ground, and that way you don't hurt the truck. But we're gonna pop the shackles off and put the CJD adjustable shackles on, and we will go from there.
At this point, you would probably be installing your Adaleaf, which we have a video on installing that on an RCKilla kit, step by step. Link will be in the description. In this case, I have a parabolic, so we're gonna be removing and replacing these shackles, and to get these off, you will need a 17 millimeter ratchet to do so. Go. Remove one side.
All right, so with the factory bushings and the factory shackle, it may need a little bit of persuasion to get out. So simple pry bar between the frame and the shackle bracket, and it should, and if you have somebody else tap on it too while you're doing it, it should come out pretty easy. But
You're good. I got it. There we go. Nice.
last but not least, on the rear, you want to loosen that front leaf bolt. The bolt side, which is on the outside of the vehicle, is a 19 millimeter, and then the capped nut on the inside is a 22. Once you break those loose, you can then install your shackle. Mike is just taking the wrench and a mallet just to pop the nut loose, and then at that point he can turn the bolt. But it sometimes just makes it easier if you can do this quick. As previously stated when I did the walkthrough at the start, our kits will come with this 1.5" Daystar lift shackle. Mike has opted to go with a CJD one here for the adjustability. Biggest benefit over this is, say you start the kit stock and it's empty, and then you add weight. As the back will drop, these adjustabilities, I think, are 1/2 inch increments, so it's 1.5", 2, and 2.5. You can raise or lower the rear depending on how your build is, and then you don't have to initially have to start with adding a new leaf pack. Or also, as in my case, when I added the tent on the back, I wanted the truck to be as level as possible for when we're camping. You can move it and adjust. You can fine tune basically your rear lift with an adjustable shackle to your liking. When it comes to installing the new bushings on the lift shackle, we here use a small amount of grease, just for corrosion resistance, or to help with the corrosion, and also just a tiny amount on each one, and then also on the lower ones, and possibly on these, depending on how the shackle goes for install. You may need to do the outside of it too, just to kind of ease with the actual shackles sliding on the bushings for install. It just, you know, a little bit of grease goes a long way on making stuff install easier. So that's what we do here. Regardless of which shackle you buy, it'll come with sleeves. There's gonna be a longer one and a shorter one. Longer one goes up top in the bushings, and then your shorter one goes in your leaf pack. Just make sure you install those before you go to put the actual shackle on. If you put an adjustable shackle on, is we always start, depending on how many holes there are on it, we usually start in the middle. Just the easiest and most safe way to go. That way you know you have adjustability up or down when you get it on the ground and see where it needs to be. If you need to adjust it up or down, it's as simple as just, you don't even have to loosen this lower one. You just simply take the tension off the top bolt, pop it out, and adjust it as needed. Shackles installed, bolts are in. Make sure everything is loose, bolts wise, on the leaf packs. You can, with an aftermarket shackle that has a sleeve, you can torque these bolts if you want now, but it's just best to torque everything while it's on the ground with the weight set to where it needs to be. That way the bushing's not twisted. The front bolt is imperative that you have to have weight on the vehicle before you torque it. Otherwise you could prematurely ruin that bearing, or bushing, sorry.
We're going to move on to putting everything back together now, starting with the driver's side shock. Uh-oh.
As Mike was installing this, we quickly realized if you have a rear shock with a reservoir, your rear sway bar on a 2020 and up Frontier or Xterra, you have to make sure the reservoir clears the sway bar link. So make sure you orient your shock in the correct position to where it doesn't hit the links. That is if you're keeping your sway bar. If you're not, you can mount it either way, but since he is keeping his rear sway bar, we had to orient with the reservoir forward to clear. Also, with how we have the shackle on the truck, this rear shock is just a hair short, so you can either jack up the diff, or when it's on the ground, as you're putting it on the ground, you can slide the bolt in. But since this one is technically sitting at 2 inches, which is a half inch higher than where the shackle would be that comes with ours, we just simply have to install the lower bolts as we lower it. But other than that, we'll get the other shock in and then button the rear up, and we'll move to the front. Also, if you did not pay attention when you took the top washer off, Nissan from the factory, this is a concave washer, and it comes, and when you install it, it is with the lip out. So you put it on here with the lip out instead of the other way. It may seem backwards, but that's how they come from the factory, so that's how it goes when you reinstall it. There it goes. Tap it all the way through. Oh, you're good. Okay. All right.
If you opt for the wheel spacers, it will come with a red Loctite. All you have to do is just put a little drop on each stud here. Once you get the red Loctite on there, then you are set to install the spacer. Like so. Each bolt is going to be a 19 millimeter.
So with us here in the benefit of having a shop and tools, we have torque sticks to tighten everything up. But if you're at home and you don't have torque sticks or impacts and all you have is like a torque wrench, you can take a pry bar and stick it in between your studs. Just be sure not to mar them up and hold them like this while you tighten everything up. Wheel spacer torque and wheel torque for your lug nuts will all be 100 foot-pounds when you install these.
Now that we're done with the rear, we're going to move up to the front, and we're going to start with removing the front 2 tires.
With the 3rd gen, there is a decorative, I call it decorative, but it's still a skid plate. There's a silver skid plate on the front that needs to be removed for you to be able to get to the sway bar bolts. On this Mike's truck, he has a full set of Victory skids, so we have to remove this main front skid to get to cam bolts to remove it so we can get the lower arms out, and also to remove the sway bar. So we are going to move on to that next, and then probably pull the sway bar first, and then we will get to doing all the other stuff.
Alright, so with the Titan swap, you are unable to use your factory sway bar in the front. So what we're going to do is we're just going to remove these. The top bolt here, you may have to use a ratchet to get to because you might not be able to reach it with an impact. But you will need to do this one here, that's on the arm, and then the 4 that are in front of the vehicle as well. Now that we got the sway bar removed, we're going to move on to the coilover. The bottom bolt and nut are going to be 19s. If you're removing a factory coilover, it will be a 14 for the top nuts. In this case, it's a 17 since I'm running our Fox extended travel kit. So we'll get to it. Once you have the shock removed, you're going to move on to your cotter pins. You're going to have one for the tie rod here, one for the CV axle here, and then one up top for the upper control arm as well. After the cotter pins, we're going to remove the lines here. After removing these out of the way, you're going to be working on the 3 nuts here. You're going to do the upper control arm nut, axle nut, and the tie rod nut as well. The axle nut's going to be 32 mil. Tie rod nut will be a 22. The upper control arm nut will be a 21.
So in order to install your tie rod extension, you have to release this jam nut on the inner tie rod, that way they'll separate. This will also pertain to second gens if you use a tie rod extension on your second gen Frontier or Xterra also. So you just take a wrench on there and a hammer and just, the tie rod will turn, so you'll know when you get, okay, let's use the right hand. So it's just loose, and then at that point, once that's loose, back it off like a half turn, release this, take your outer off. Make sure you don't mess with this, that way when you drive to your alignment, it'll be close. So when we get ready to install the extension, I'll show you how to put it back together. So yeah, now there you go. You can take the outer tie rod off. Okay, so your outer tie rod's here. Here's your tie rod extension. You will want to put some red Loctite on the threads of your extension, and then simply screw it back in, bottom it out. You can hand tighten it for now. When you go to drive this, make sure you take 2 wrenches and tighten this more, but for now this is fine just to get it back together. And then at that point, screw it back on, and then it doesn't matter where the end ends up because this rotates within, so make sure it's tight, full turn off, and then it should end up pretty much where it was, but then you can just hand tighten the nut there for now and leave it. At that point you can move on to the upper. There you go.
Oh, there we go.
We're going to put the jack underneath the knuckle just to support everything. If you do not have the jack on there, you can stretch your ABS line or your brake lines. Right now, if you stretch your brake line, it's really not that big of an issue because you're switching it out anyways, but just as a general rule, you want to have some support under here for when you do stuff. So
we got the top castle nut off the upper control arm. Now we're going to work on getting the axle out of there. You can notice I left the nut on there so I have something to hit. You don't want to hit the axle directly, you can damage it, and then yeah, that would not be fun.
Okay. Turn it this way.
Blue.
While Mike's cleaning up the CV axle, I'm going to take the upper control arm loose. Factory bolts are 19 mil on both sides. Usually easiest to use a wrench on both the nut and the bolt, but that's what I'm going to do real quick just so we can get this cruising.
Now that we have the old upper control arm out, we're going to be installing the new Titan arm using the original hardware. Once you have the upper control arm installed, wait to torque the nuts until the vehicle is on the ground. Before starting on the lower control arm, you're going to want to put your upper control arm back in place and loosely just put the castle nut back on so it holds everything in place while you remove the lower control arm.
Next step is going to be the lower control arm. There's a ball joint pinch bolt here. Got a 17 millimeter head on the bolt and a 19 on the nut. And then you'll move to your cam bolts or your lower control arm bolts, however you have them. I want to say the factory control arm bolts are a 19 and a 21, but I'm not 100% positive. If you have our cam bolts, I know the nut is a 21 and the head of the bolt is a 22. And that's what we have in here. So you'll do this. The ball joint may fight coming out. What we found is to use a chisel to pry this open a hair, and then you just hammer on the control arm. The ball joint should eventually pop out, but first you have to remove this bolt. So we'll do that. Before you actually release everything, what we found on the 3rd gens is you need to take the caliper off. That way the hose doesn't limit anything. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just take the caliper off its bracket, and I'm gonna zip tie it on the control arm. That way it's up and out of the way and everything can move in its full movement. And the bolts on the caliper bracket are just 14s. Okay. All right, yeah.
Next step I'm going to do is wedge this chisel into the bottom of the spindle here to release the joint. Next I'm going to take a punch here and try to hit the ball joint out from the bottom of the spindle. There we go. Now that we've got the lower control arm out, it's time to replace it with the new Titan arm. Okay, we've got the lower control arm in, so we're going to work on getting the CV axle next. You notice we got a little jack under the lower control arm so it doesn't fall away from the vehicle. Once the lower control arm is supported by the jack, go ahead and remove your castle nut and remove the upper control arm out of the way. So once the CV is in place, go ahead and put your castle nut back up on top of the control arm, and then go ahead and just place your axle nut. Once you have both the castle nut and the axle nut in place, go ahead and put your tie rod back into place as well.
Yep.
There we go. Now that we've got everything in place, it's time for the good stuff. We're going to put the coilover in, get her bolted up. Okay, we've got the coilover in, so now we're going to work on getting the lower cam bolts snug but not tight. Also, before you tighten these back up, you want to make sure the fat side of these washers are pointing towards the sky. Once you got the lower cam bolts nice and tight, we're going to work on torquing the castle nut for the upper control arm, and that torque is 58. Torque spec for the axle nut is going to be 101 foot-pounds of torque, and the torque spec for the tie rod is going to be 63 foot-pounds as well. Okay. And just like the upper control arm castle nut, you will have cotter pins for both the axle nut and tie rod nut. Now we're going to move down to the lower ball joint nut and bolt. That is 70 foot-pounds of torque. Okay, it's time to do the lower eyelet for the coilover, and that is 100 foot-pound of torque. Next step is to replace the brake line with the extended brake line. We're going to start by cracking the upper nut here, and then we'll remove the lock tab as well. Now that we've got the top of the line cracked, we're going to work on getting the lower bolt out. Once this is removed, we will place the caliper back into its space, and then we will continue to replace it with the new extended brake line. Well, you're probably going to want something to catch any residual fluid once you remove that bottom bolt, because it will leak quite a bit.
There you go. And then, like I said, your bolts are back.
So once we got the extended brake line installed, we had to check for any issues with clearance. All we did is we threw on the tire, and then we threw it lock left and lock right to make sure that nothing was touching. On this particular one, we had to bend it just slightly just to clear the tires. Once you find your clearance, go ahead and zip tie or wire manage however you please. Now that we got everything buttoned up in the front, it's time to get to bleeding the brakes. All right. Whoa. Brakes are bled, and now we're going to grease up our ball joints on both sides. Boop.
Hi, I'm making a guest appearance. You may have just seen me take a measurement from hub defender here. What I was doing is, at the moment we're trying to set the bushing positions. So you want to have the vehicle basically simulated at ride height. We have the rear supported right now, and we use a jack stand to bring the spindle up to about 23.5 inches. Typically on a Titan swap, you're going to be anywhere between 23 and 24 inches on your hub defender here. So we just get everything roughly into position so that we could get our torques in. This is a lot easier to do this way rather than having the wheel on the vehicle and trying to reach in to get your nuts and bolts tightened. So this is a little bit time saving and just a little bit of convenience, but it's worth the work. Your upper control arm torque specs are going to be 90 foot-pound here and 100 foot-pound at your lower control arm cam bolts. And make sure to torque on the nut, not on the head of the bolt. Do it slow.
Yep. All right, now that we've got the front all buttoned up, we're gonna throw the tires back on. Then we're gonna go back to the back, finish, check everything, make sure everything's all buttoned up back there, set it on the ground and see where we're sitting, and then we'll determine whether or not we need to adjust the rear height or not, and go from there. Torque spec for wheels will be 100 foot-pounds.
Now pull forward, hard brake.
So we got the truck on the ground. As you could tell, there's a lot of toe. So basically Chad is trying to eyeball the toe in so I can actually drive it to an alignment shop without ruining my tires. Chad went around the truck, measured hub defender, front and rear. I'm still sitting at about a ½ inch of rake, which is pretty good. So we're gonna keep it there. All we have left to do is basically just button up the rear end, lower shock bolt, and then tighten the front of the parabolic bolt as well. All right, so we're going to torque the front bolts on the parabolic spring, and that would be 84 foot-pounds of torque as well. Got it. Upper and lower are going to be 77 foot-pounds. I cannot run the rear sway bar. You were just going to take it off. It'll be 19 millimeter bolts for the top, and they should just come right up.
Yeah, yeet!
So we finally got everything buttoned up in the truck. Took it for a test drive. Felt amazing. We're sitting at about a ½ inch of rake, I believe is what Chad said, which is pretty optimal for what I run in the truck. Thank you for watching this how-to video on how to install a Titan swap. In this case, it was a 3rd gen Frontier. Hope it helps you in any way possible. If you have any questions or whatever, you can comment. We'll try to get back to you as soon as we can. Again, this is Mike Perez from All Dogs Off-Road. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.